my gentle and of course very modern apes, you know I read every single comment that I get on videos on this channel. Even if I just read them in like the little drop-down menu, I read all of them whenever I get notifications. And I noticed something weird recently. A rash of extremely negative, hateful, I would say, comments that are all extremely subtly placed exclusively on my videos that deconstruct everything that clownish grifter Robert Sepehr has to say. Hi everyone, editing gutsickgibbon here. I thought I would put a little series of timestamps here at the beginning for those Robert Sepehr fans who cannot stomach a single bad word being said about their weird esoteric papa. So before you go to the comments section and whinge about me being mean to Robert Sepehr for the fact that he is a racist loser, please consider visiting these timestamps and hear the actual arguments that I have against Robert Sepehr's inexplicable misunderstanding of out of Africa as a hypothesis and its current status in biological anthropology. I put this at the beginning so you would have no excuse. Now, you might be wondering, who is Robert Sepehr? Because I haven't covered this guy on this channel in quite some time. It's been over a year. I would describe Robert Sepehr as an intellectually stunted, socially awkward, not very subtly racist loser who has a YouTube channel that peddles a myriad of different conspiracies, but nevertheless has a moderately sized fan base composed mostly of similarly intellectually stunted, not so subtly racist losers.
You know, there is a difference between talking shit about a person and talking truth about a shitty person.
I cover a lot of creationists and pseudoscientists of many different stripes on this channel, and none are as blatantly horrible in just about every way as Robert Sepehr. Like, he gets the usual points for being wrong about just about everything that he talks about, something that I've underscored many times on this channel that all his fans just ignore conveniently. But he's also a horrible person and just an outspoken racist. Oh, and they're anti-Semitic. How could I forget that part? How silly of me. A high charge, I know, but I don't think I have a reputation here on YouTube for making accusations that I can't back up, so I will do so momentarily. First, I want to address the Robert Sepehr fans who are watching this video, who are cracking their knuckles, telling mommy to hold off on the tendies because they've got to destroy a duplicitous femoid on the internet. I want to tell you guys that none of you ever have actually made any kind of academic, scientific, or evidentiary argument against out of Africa or human evolution from earlier, more basal apes. You just show up in my comments section and you say that I look Jewish. And then you call me a mean name or insult my parents or something like that. So off the bat, I'm going to encourage you to watch the whole video or go back and watch the videos where I actually make arguments against what Robert Sepehr is saying instead of just getting sad that someone on the internet was being mean to daddy and you need to come to his rescue. You know, you don't even need to go through my back catalog to hear the arguments that I'm going to make against Robert Sepehr's insane comprehension of the current state of biological anthropology with regard to hypotheses like out of Africa or evolution from more basal apes, because he makes the same brain-dead arguments in the video we're going over today. So we're gonna have to rehash all of it. Yay. I'm going to start by reading some of the more recent comments that I've gotten because I think they are extremely funny, and I, again, as I say every time when I do this kind of clip, when I do this bit, I love to make money off of people being rude to me. I think that it's funny in a cosmic way, and I know some of you might be thinking, well, Erica, this is going to poison the well. You can't put poison in a septic tank. What's a drop of arsenic in a vat of botulinum toxin? I got this one today. She's so irritating, I refuse to believe she has ever been on a date. Well, I'm married, so I've actually been on quite a few. This one says, this video can be summarized in the angry woke chick meme with the tears and the commie flag background. This isn't a politics channel, and I think if you think that it is, you might need to reevaluate a lot about your personal worldview. A woman using his name to try and get famous, LOL. Robert Sepehr fans don't like women very much. Does that surprise you? I'd bolster that case by showing the comments that are held for review. It didn't pass the filter, but that would get this video demonetized. This guy's left a lot of comments. He says, well, I think you're in the globalist Rockefeller so-called education cult. Funny you think you're speaking truth to power. You are not. It wouldn't be a Robert Sepehr comment if they didn't use the wrong your contraction. And if you thought that one was too subtle, we got this one that says, okay, Jew. Usually those ones don't pass YouTube's auto filter. Like, for instance, here's a series of comments that were held for review. The first guy says, finding out this girl is Jewish explains this video entirely. Robert exposes the out of the Jews. Then the second guy says, what's wrong with this girl? And the third guy replies, in a word, Jew. So notably, again, none of these comments actually have any arguments against Out of Africa or any of the other biological anthropology subjects that I tackled in any of the videos, because these come from 3 separate videos, and most of these comments really fall into like one of 4 boxes. The first is that Erica is wrong because she is either jealous of Robert or attracted to Robert. Now, I am not jealous of the psychotic, unhinged fans that follow Robert Sepehr around. I don't want them within a 50-mile radius of me, to be honest, because I am afraid of them. I'm worried they would harm me physically. That's how psychologically imbalanced I think a lot of them are. For the second part, again, I'm married, but also Robert Sepehr is like a racist old man, which is just about as far from attractive as you can get, like in my eyes.
And I'm like, oh, that's cool, man, because grandfather's gonna try to get me to join the Confederacy again.
The second is that Erica's wrong because she is left of center, I guess, which is true, but I don't really talk about my politics here on YouTube, and I don't understand how Out of Africa is considered being left of center. I mean, you would have to be pretty far right. Your Overton window would have to be pretty misaligned to perceive it that way. The third, of course, is Erica is wrong because she is a woman. I think that's self-explanatory.
Duplicitous femoid.
And the fourth is that Erica is wrong because she is Jewish. Also self-explanatory. Unfortunately, none of these comments addressed any of the genetic or paleontological supports, whether they came in the form of studies or just examining actual physical specimens in the case of the hominins. They just kind of drop in, cry a little, and then leave, which is lame.
Cringe.
So that's the kind of fan base that Robert Sepehr cultivates. And now I want to show you a little clip as to what Robert Sepehr himself is like, or at least what he was like very recently on Twitter before he was banned. I'm going to throw up a quick content warning for racism and dumbassery here.
Do you really think who you fall in love with is not influenced by every TV show, every movie, every advertisement, every classroom, every magazine, and every music video, all portraying interracial couples? Are you sure your thoughts and desires are yours and not programming? Just 1 or 2 generations after World War II, and the best a news outlet can do is call this pre-Viking. What an embarrassment. No wonder your daughters are twerking for a living and can only speak Ebonics. Japan's original inhabitants were Caucasian. Buddhism, an Aryan religion attributed to blonde, blue-eyed Aryans, was disseminated to 3/4 of Asia by Aryans. This includes Korea, China, Thailand, Mongolia, etc. That said, the swastika predates Buddhism, as do the Aryans. Africa is larger than the United States and Europe combined, with a population of 1.3 billion, yet can't duplicate what was achieved elsewhere, with the exception of South Africa and the Mediterranean. Why not, if DNA does not allegedly influence IQ, behavior, and race does not really exist? This could have been us. Pictured, a hunter-gatherer duo starting a fire. But white people ruined it. Pictured, a duo of rappers. How is it that blacks can become billionaires using mediums almost exclusively from white civilization? As this sort of thing does not happen in Haiti or the Congo, where they still did not develop soap. Yet all I hear is complaining and blaming. Or rioting, looting, and robbing.
Go to hell, go back where you belong.
Stunningly, after all of that, and that clip compilation is in all my Robert Sepehr videos for a reason, he still has fans. In fact, most of them are insisting that Robert Sepehr isn't just right, but he's also not even a racist. Okay. The definition of racism, and I pulled it up to make sure I wasn't dreaming here, is that a racist is characterized by showing prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. So I'm not really sure who could be qualified as a racist, if not Robert Sepehr, on the basis of those tweets, the type of fan base that he's cultivated, and like the most recent video that he put out, the one we're going to be going over today. But first we have one more hilarious thing to talk about that I think really paints Robert's character in a bad light, as if it could be painted in even worse shade. So apparently Robert Sepehr is back on Twitter. Now, I thought he was still banned, but I guess thanks to Elon Musk's super free speech policy, we get to have Robert Sepehr's thoughts and opinions grace our timeline once again. Now, I wanted to see what Robert Sepehr had to say so that I could add it to my clip compilation, but as it turns out, Robert Sepehr has preemptively blocked me on Twitter, which I guess I understand. But what I don't understand is why Robert Sepehr would publicly get into disagreements with people on Twitter, agree to a debate, and then run away and block that person. Historian Dr. David Miano tweeted, "This interesting fellow called me a bunch of names and challenged me to debate him, and after I accepted, he started making excuses and blocked me." I find this funny because Robert Sepehr fans are always in my comments asking me to debate Robert, and like, I would be happy to. I know a ton of others who would be happy to as well. Zeke Darwin on Twitter, who's been blocked by Robert Sepehr, Ancient Puzzles on Twitter, who's been blocked by Robert Sepehr. All of us would be happy to chat with him, but he's too much of a sniveling coward. Mr. Sepehr starts us off extremely strongly by taking a quote from Charles Darwin, which is like pretty racist, and using it evidently to bolster the case that he is about to make. Now, Charles Darwin is a man from the 1800s. I would be absolutely floored if there was anyone from that time period that wouldn't be considered pretty racially insensitive by modern standards. But like, as far as people went, Charles Darwin during his time was pretty progressive. Not only was he an abolitionist, but he also believed that all humans descend from a single common ancestor and did not take the multi-regionalist ideas of the day seriously. He thought all races were, of course, human and shared a common ancestor in the pretty recent past. Robert goes on to define taxonomy and then muses as to why humans like to categorize things. Naturally, he does not mention cladistics, phonetics, or phylogenetics during this brief description, but he goes on to say this:
classification of many species, old and new, continues to be hotly debated as scientists find new information or interpret facts in new ways.
Let's make something abundantly clear. The relationship of the terminal ends of branches can still change sometimes depending on how well characterized these species were in the past. So, for instance, the relationship between three tamarin species, Saguinus mitis, Saguinus bicolor, and Saguinus martensi, might switch around, with martensi and bicolor being more closely related than either is to mitis. But we're not still wondering about the relationship between genus Saguinus and genus Calothrix, or those two with genus Leontopithecus. Callitrichidae is well established. Likewise, this kind of stuff is not changing in other lineages or in other orders, classes, families of organisms either. It's only the specifics at the terminal ends of branches that are still really subject to change, and that's just because we're continuing to hone our genomic sequencing. I guess I should specify that within mammals this is the case. I have no idea what they're doing over in other domains of life. Maybe that is more subject to change. But to be abundantly clear, what Robert is kind of alluding to here, and what he's going to allude to a little bit later, is that maybe humans aren't as firmly within primates and apes as we previously thought. Or maybe there's greater differences between the races than we previously thought. No, Robert. In coding base pairs, humans are nearly 99% similar to chimpanzees and vice versa. They're more closely related to us than they are to, say, gorillas, and that holds for bonobos as well. So humans are firmly apes. But also, the genetic diversity within Homo sapiens is ridiculously low. Humans are a single species, full stop. The difference between you and basically any other human on Earth is so minute, it's actually kind of insane. And again, we're a pretty narcissistic species, so organizations like the Thousand Genomes Project have ensured that we know extremely well what the human genome looks like in its sort of archetypal sense, and we know what kind of variation is encompassed in anatomically modern humans, as well as including archaic DNA.
Arguments are fierce, and species do change names, in large part due to recent advances in genomic sequencing, which is why many species are being re-evaluated because of DNA analysis, which can change our ideas of how closely two species are related, and so their classification can change.
Setting aside the garbled composition of that entire little section, again, it's the terminal branches that are changing. And not only that, but the majority of these scuffles over species is kind of between this battle of like convenience and the importance of conservation. So new species and subspecies are identified because it's a lot easier to protect an organism if it is identified via nomenclature as distinct.
Classification in the 1700s was based entirely on morphological characteristics of the organism. In other words, those that looked most alike were put closest together in each category. Now, a radical shift in the grouping of organisms is occurring with the development of DNA technologies. Sequencing of the genetic code of an organism reveals a great deal of information about its similarity with and relationship to other organisms.
Okay, like, that's not so bad. So far, so good. This is like the longest Robert has ever gone without making a mistake in one of these videos.
And this classification often goes against the traditional morphological classification.
There it is. This is simply not true. The overall organization of phylogenetics as it exists today has not changed that much from like traditional phonetics and cladograms from back in the day. Certainly not within primates. The majority of the surprises come from things like cetaceans, which are actually artiodactyls.
Scientists are debating which species are most closely related and why.
Species, sometimes. Genera, no. Like, hominins and panins are indeed more closely related to each other than either is to a gorillan, for example.
Before the 1930s, bonobos were considered a subspecies of chimp and were called pygmy chimps. But researchers decided, based on the physical differences, that these smaller apes are distinctive enough to warrant separate species status.
So the separate species status of chimpanzees and bonobos, so Pan troglodytes and Pan paniscus, is rooted not just in morphologic differences, but also genetic and behavioral differences. I'm not 100% sure why he decided to do that screed on genetics and then proceed to go, yeah, so genetics is causing us to reevaluate a lot of species classifications, like for instance, bonobos, who based on morphologic differences are considered to be a separate species from chimpanzees. Like, logically, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But again, even if this was a point, and it's not for reasons I just mentioned, we're still talking about within panins. We're talking about terminal ends of branches, not the differences between panins as a group and hominins as a group. You're still an ape, Robert. And that is not going to change because the human genome is completely sequenced and the chimpanzee genome is almost there. So Robert goes on to then have a beef with the biological species concept. Now this I can understand. I very much dislike the biological species concept as like this set in stone way to identify species because, as I've said many times before, species is a static concept applied to a dynamic system that is the evolution of organisms. But Robert is beefing with it for a very specific reason, because he wants to say that just because two things can interbreed doesn't mean they're not different species. That's okay. He's going to go on and heavily imply, I guess you can be the judge as to the weight of this implication, but he goes on to imply that just because human races can interbreed, that might not mean that they're the same species. Critically, he also uses a really garbage example for this. His okay example is chimps and bonobos, although they won't interbreed in the wild, only when they're forced to in captivity because they have no other options for potential mates. But he brings up a recent hybrid between, I believe it was a domestic dog and a pampas fox. Pampas foxes are not foxes. They're false foxes. So they're actually more closely related to dogs and wolves than they are to true foxes, like members of Vulpes. But Robert goes on, he brings up ligers, how they can sometimes be fertile, same thing with mules. And if you had any doubt as to where this was going, he caps off this intro by saying,
DNA has allowed scientists to better understand and redefine what makes a species. And we now know that different species can and do produce viable offspring. which brings us to the hybridization of modern humans.
Again, genetics is not causing us to reconsider what a species is. It's not making us redefine species. It's making things more complicated because it's revealing that, in fact, reproductive isolation is even squishier and more of a smudge than we had previously considered. But yes, evidently, Robert is going to make the argument that I suggested he is kind of implying earlier. And finally, after this long-winded intro, which, stones and glass houses, he gets started with the famous Robert Sepehr ukulele cover. As always, this is the best part of a Robert Sepehr video because he is not speaking.
Admixture, the genetic merging of parental populations resulting in mixed ancestry, has occurred frequently throughout the course of human history. Numerous admixture events have occurred between human populations across the world, as well as introgression between humans and archaic humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and super archaic hominin species in sub-Saharan Africa.
I would bet that if you asked Robert Sepehr what the difference between introgression and admixture was, he wouldn't be able to tell it to you, so I'm going to tell it to you now. Introgression is when population A introduces genes into population B, whereas admixture is when gene flow is occurring between these populations. So A gets some of B's alleles and B gets some of A's alleles. But how nice that we're already getting a hint as to where this video is going, where he talks about how Neanderthals and Denisovans are introducing genes into the genomes of archaic or ancient Homo sapiens that still persist to this day, and then super archaics, which by the language itself, he means to be more primitive or basal, are introducing genes specifically into sub-Saharan African populations. We'll get into it more later, but I just want to preface by saying that his characterization of the situation is not just offensive, but it's also dead wrong.
The mosaic of cross-species interbreeding has resulted in what is traditionally known as races.
This guy has achieved a level of loser that science didn't even think possible.
And our current understanding of this hybridization has irrefutably dispensed with the now obsolete out-of-Africa replacement model, which postulated a single origin for modern humans that allegedly left Africa and replaced all other hominin populations, mutating and evolving along the way.
Wow, a lot to unpack there. A lot of wrong things. First, there is no one out there, not a soul, who is seriously conducting any kind of work who supposes that races are the result of admixture between archaic Homo sapiens populations and different types of other hominins living at the same time. Out of Africa broadly posits that all modern humans can trace their ancestry back to a population that began within the African continent, specifically usually in East Africa, and that population migrated out of Africa and settled in different portions of the world, which led to different modern populations through time and adaptation. This is a separate thing from the various types of replacement models, which attempt to explain the process of Homo sapiens as a species migration out of Africa and how it encountered, engaged with, and interbred with local hominin populations in various locations that they spread into, such as Europe, where we encountered Neanderthals, or East Asia, where we encountered Denisovans. Originally, the replacement model held that Homo sapiens moved to these various locations and basically replaced, as the hypothesis says, the local groups of hominins because of one reason or another, maybe being better suited for the environment or more innovative, what have you. In the original conception of the model, this replacement happened without gene flow between Homo sapiens and whatever hominin population we were considering. Thanks to genomic work, we know that hominins did exchange genes with Homo sapiens as they arrived in these various locations, and that replacement theory wasn't as simple as Homo sapiens moving into a location, outcompeting or wiping out whatever was already there, and then being the only hominin left after enough time had passed. So replacement hypotheses have received tune-ups as genetics has continued to unveil the degree of introgression and admixture between various different hominin populations. But you know what hasn't received a massive tune-up and still stands as a robust idea? out of Africa. In fact, genetic work has continued to support the idea that Homo sapiens began within East Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, a notion that is also supported by the fossil record. This is why Robert has to say out of Africa replacement theory instead of out of Africa generally. He is using the fact that replacement hypotheses have changed and then attaching that to out of Africa and then saying that that as a unit has changed, which if you couple them together, the unit has changed, just not the out of Africa part. This little bait and switch is evident because what Robert says, like, immediately after the previous little section is this.
The replacement model is no longer a viable theory, as admitted to by its leading proponent, Professor Chris Stringer.
That's suspicious. That's weird.
He's going to go back to the little coupling method here in a second, but I want to preface before we get into the Chris Stringer stuff that I reached out to Chris Stringer on Twitter to get his take on all of this because Robert Sepehr, like I said, has just been getting raked over the coals on Twitter recently, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but just giving you a little foreshadowing.
I came across an article this week quoting Professor Stringer, a British physical anthropologist noted for his work on human evolution and considered one of the world's foremost experts and proponents of the now obsolete and debunked out of Africa replacement model.
Just FYI, again, it's not debunked and Robert does nothing to debunk it in this video. He goes on to describe the out of Africa replacement theory like this,
which argued that human species left Africa and mutated into the various races we have today, killing or replacing the other hominins. We now know conclusively, genetically, that this is false, and that the various races exist today because of hybridization. We are all various mixes of these different hominin species.
Do you see what he has done there? He describes out of Africa, and then he describes a strict replacement hypothesis that hominins, specifically Homo sapiens, are moving into each of these locations and fully wiping out without any gene flow each endemic hominin before replacing it with their own group. And yes, that latter half is not true. We know this because of genomic sequencing of modern humans and also using ancient DNA. But that first part is still completely valid and still stands as the best supported hypothesis for human migration and Homo sapiens' origins. That's why he has to couple them together so that he could pretend that both are debunked because the latter has been revised. And then there's that entire portion about how various races are the result of different hybridization events in the past. So first of all, no biological anthropologist recognizes race as a biological reality. It simply isn't. Populations exist and can be considered within their local environments, but no, race is not real in a biological sense. This is appreciated by pretty much everyone. To that point, there is no one that is saying that the races exist because of ancient hybridization. That's a Robert original. So you have Robert Sepehr combining a bunch of different things here. The original out of Africa idea, which still stands and has not in the slightest been debunked. Replacement theory, which has been revised, and then Robert Sepehr is sneaking his own little Sepehr ideas into there that are completely baseless and boneheaded, to be honest. He's going to go on here and try to bolster his entire model by exclusively providing support for hybridization between ancient populations of Homo sapiens and ancient non-Homo sapiens hominins like Neanderthals and Denisovans.
A 2018 paper published in the journal Nature reported evidence of multiple episodes of interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens.
So yes, this is true.
Another 2018 paper, also in Nature, described evidence of an ancient human hybrid who had both Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA.
This is true too, although the way Robert phrases it here makes me think that he thinks it's Neanderthal, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. I believe it was an F1 hybrid, so first generation hybrid between a member of Denisovans and a member of Neanderthalensis.
This has led some scholars to argue that many Homo species, including ours, should be lumped together. Stringer, however, maintains that humans and Neanderthals are separate species because their bone structure is different. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens remain separate long enough to evolve such distinct skull shapes, pelvises, and ear bones, they can be regarded as different species, interbreeding or not. He wrote in an article for the Natural History Museum in London.
I think Robert thinks he stumbled onto like a gotcha here, where the biological species concept is being applied like universally, except when it isn't. And then he's like, haha, but then why do you apply it to human races as justification that all members of Homo sapiens are the same species? Why do you do that if you supposedly ascribe to this biological species concept? And then Chris Stringer also does it with hominins, so gotcha. And it's like, okay, no. People don't all subscribe to the biological species concept. It works great with extant species some of the time, right? But it still gets confounded by many species of mammals, many birds, and so on and so forth. Species concepts are a point of hot debate because everyone recognizes that species are one squishy, like at the very least, they're extremely squishy. And also, a lot of people, myself included, don't think that species are a biological unit in the sense that they're like a real biological reality that can be standardized across all of life. Again, I go over this in a video here on this channel. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are ridiculously similar to one another, but they still fall outside of one another's morphologic variation and genomic variation. So Neanderthals and humans could exchange genes, but that doesn't mean that, one, all of the offspring were in and of themselves fertile, but also all modern humans are still more genetically similar to one another than any is to a member of Homo neanderthalensis. The point being, part of the logic that we use to say that Neanderthals are in fact a separate species from Homo sapiens on the basis of their morphologic variation and genetic variation serves to support the fact that all members of Homo sapiens, extant and archaic, are members of the same species. Not different species, Robert. So now Robert is going to play a clip from Chris Stringer's interview, and he sped it up, and since I've sped up Robert here to avoid getting copyrighted by his channel, it's going to sound super fast, so my apologies to Dr. Stringer if he sees this.
Well, at the moment, I'm certainly looking again at the whole question of a recent African origin for modern humans, because that's been the leading idea over the last 20 years, that we had a recent African origin, that we came out of Africa and we replaced all these other humans that were outside of Africa. And we're having to reevaluate that now.
I'm sorry, I don't think I quite heard that right. Could you please come again?
We're having to come and look at out of Africa again, and also even look at the species concepts we've got.
I like the record scratch, Robert. Very 90s sitcom. Thank you for supporting once again the notion that you are not a very funny person. Now, keeping that in mind, Robert sounds very smug here for a reason, because that little snippet of Chris Stringer does in fact sound like he's saying, in addition to reevaluating different replacement hypotheses, that we're also reconsidering what he says specifically is a recent African origin for modern humans. So I heard that and I was like, that's weird, because I follow Chris Stringer on Twitter, and I know exactly what he thinks about out of Africa. So I decided to follow the source that Robert conveniently put to the side and see exactly what this interview contains. So here's the exact source. Now, this is from 2011, which should already set off some alarm bells for you guys, because Robert is saying that this is a recent transition that paleoanthropologists seem to have had, but like this is obviously over a decade out of date. But the real punchline here that is going to come as a shock to absolutely no one is in the very first paragraph that shows up on this article, where Stringer says, I'm thinking a lot about species concepts as applied to humans, about the out-of-Africa model, and also looking back into Africa itself. I think the idea that modern humans originated in Africa is still a sound concept. Behaviorally and physically, we began our story there, but I've come around to thinking that it wasn't a simple origin. 20 years ago, I would have argued that our species evolved in one place, maybe East or South Africa. There was a period of time in just one place where a small population of humans became modern physically and behaviorally, isolated and perhaps stressed by climate change. This drove a rapid and punctuated origin for our species. Now I don't think it was that simple, either within or outside of Africa. Now,
You're under arrest, Nimrod.
It's not possible for you to read this article without reading that first paragraph, I don't think. So, strike one against Robert. Obviously, he's not beating the weasel allegations, but okay, right? So maybe Robert didn't read the article. You scroll down and you can find the section that he's quoting, and again, he reads this section here aloud. He plays the clip from the interview that goes to this point. Well, maybe Robert literally didn't read it. His reading comprehension has previously shown itself to be not very strong, so maybe what he did was he just watched the video. So let's watch the video. Fortunately, the parts that Robert clips are right at the beginning.
Well, at the moment, I'm certainly looking again at the whole question of a recent African origin for modern humans, because that's been the leading idea of the last 20 years, that we had a recent African origin, that we came out of Africa and we replaced all these other humans that were outside of Africa. And we're having to reevaluate that now, because genetic data show that the modern humans who came out of Africa maybe 60,000 years ago actually interbred with Neanderthals, first of all, and then some of them later on interbred with another group of people called the Denisovans over in Eastern Asia. So
now, that's where Robert cuts it off, right? You can see it. Here it is. Cha-ching. So let's hear the very next sentence.
We are not purely a recent African origin. We're mostly recent African origin, but there was contact with these other so-called species. So
I'm sorry.
Mission Control, we have a belligerent dumbass here that won't cooperate.
What happened there, Robert? Did you cut it off a little too early by accident, I'm sure? Robert strikes me as the litigious type, so I'm not going to say that this was intentionally deceptive. I'm going to chalk this up to Robert being, silly.
At the end of the day, it's just another example of you being stupid.
Now, like I said earlier, Robert is in the process of getting, severely rolled on Twitter, which is very funny. But Zeke Darwin has also made a video about Robert Sepehr dunking on him. I mentioned Zeke earlier. And hilariously, right, he posted his video. He was like, yeah, Robert Sepehr is getting dunked on Twitter right now. Here's my video busting his chops. And in response to this, Chris Stringer actually commented. I believe Zeke's interviewed Chris Stringer before. I'm pretty sure that that's how they know each other, but I'm not positive. So Chris Stringer comments and says, great critique, Zeke Darwin. This drew attention to this equally awful one, which even grabs from some of my interviews. So Chris Stringer has seen Robert Sepehr's video and his horrible clipping of Chris Stringer. So I wanted to do my due diligence here, right? This is an opportunity. So I said to Chris, hi, Chris, I'm covering this most recent piece by Sepehr now. His transparent attempt to weaponize your interview is ridiculous. May I ask for my video, would you say Sepehr adequately understands the current consensus of out of Africa as a hypothesis? And Chris said, I would say he doesn't.
That sucks. That's,
So to be abundantly clear, the person that Robert Sepehr is trying to utilize to make his point, to make himself sound better, to lend himself some credibility, is just point blank no, this guy is not understanding my current position, nor is he understanding the position of the field as a whole, and even explicitly points out that the video that the interview is being used in is garbage. You might feel charitable and say, well, maybe Robert watched that first little part and then just cut the video off because he was like, aha, this is great, and that's irresponsible, but maybe he actually didn't see the rest of the video. But no, Sepehr actually just goes on to play clips that occur after that bit we just covered, so he definitely saw it.
The fact that we can show that they evolved through time in a particular direction, distinct from modern humans, and they separated maybe 400,000 years ago from our lineage. So they're in that position of being either a part of Homo sapiens, but a very different part to anyone alive today, or, as I prefer to argue, they're a separate species, a separate evolutionary history.
Neanderthals are genetically distinct from modern humans, but are more closely related to us than chimpanzees are, for example.
What's cool about that part is Sepehr actually talks about how Neanderthals are also genetically distinct from us. How do you suppose that we recognize that, Robert? How do you suppose that we come to the conclusion that they're genetically distinct? The answer is that Neanderthals fall outside of all modern human variation, like their full genomes do, which would of course suggest that all humans are one singular species, unlike what Robert is attempting to imply here.
The first modern human specimen discovered was called Cro-Magnon, so I use that term generically. Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon overlapped and interbred about 50,000 years ago, but never in sub-Saharan Africa.
Oh my goodness, Robert. What a horrible blunder you've made here. So Cro-Magnon is the name given to the first anatomically modern Homo sapiens found in Europe. This does not mean that Cro-Magnon is the oldest anatomically modern Homo sapiens. In fact, Robert, it's not even the oldest anatomically modern Homo sapiens from Europe. So I figured what I would do is just go over some of the basics with you here. In fact, this chapter 13, titled Anatomically Modern Homo sapiens by Bridget Holt, from a book titled Basics in Human Evolution from 2015, should hopefully help us go through some of the first members of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. And I know that Robert will probably watch this because he's pretty narcissistic. So let's just go ahead and do some quick checking here. For the sake of timestamps, I'm going to call this section the morphologic features of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and to put it pretty simply, these features can be boiled down more or less to a vertical forehead, a chin, further reduction of the teeth, and a globular brain case. Those features are obviously like craniodental in nature, but I think that that's nice for us here. It's pretty simple and straightforward. Obviously, there's minutia in the postcrania as well, but I'm saying this because the source that we just looked at by Holt from 2015 has a nice chart that goes through from oldest to youngest, our anatomically modern Homo sapiens specimen. At 150 to 200,000 years ago, we have the Homo kibish specimens from East Africa. Slightly younger than that, we have the Hairto specimen from East Africa. Slightly younger than that, we have the Singa specimen from East Africa. And slightly younger than that, we have the Mumba specimen from East Africa. Now, I know what you're thinking, Robert. Oh no, these are so many African specimens. Like, what am I going to do with my race realist perspective here? Don't worry, we're moving away from East Africa to the Cleisis River specimen from South Africa. After that, our oldest specimens are found in Southwest Asia, followed by Africa again, continuing in Africa to North Africa, and finally we have the first non-African or Southwest Asian specimen from Western Siberia. But the first specimen from Europe, again, is our PCO1 specimen, which I know I'm going to mispronounce that, so that's why I'm saying PCO, from Eastern Europe at approximately 35,000 years ago. Looking at the morphology of these specimens as well, we know that they are not fundamentally different than the Cro-Magnon 1 individual that Robert continues to point out and insist is the oldest member of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, a notion that is just brutally incorrect. And that's just on morphology. Robert is going to fumble the genetics even more severely, so let's get to that. First, he starts off all right by discussing a somewhat recent paper in Nature that details the hybridization of ancient Homo sapiens and ancient Homo neanderthalensis, which is responsible for a portion of modern humans today having 2 to 4% of Neanderthal within their genome.
As a result, everyone today whose ancestors lived outside of sub-Saharan Africa at the time has inherited a small but significant amount of Neanderthal DNA, which makes up about 2% of their genomes.
Then he says this:
Sub-Saharan Africans inherited a much larger amount of archaic DNA from an entirely different species.
Already loading that language a little bit, huh, Robert? But we'll get to that a little bit more later, as he says.
But I will discuss that later. Which brings us to another distinct hominin discovery called the Denisovans.
Robert mentions Denisovans, which is another ancient hominin that interbred with Homo sapiens, specifically in East Asia and China, that are contemporaries seem to say that it's around 4 to 6%, so about the same amount of Neanderthal DNA in folks from Europe and Western Asia. Lorena and colleagues in 2021 argue that a Philippine group called the Ada has 30 to 40% more than the previous highest. So if the previous highest was 6%, this is pushing 8 to 9%, which is close to 12, but still not quite there. I'm going to dig around and see if I can find the 12% source. I suspect that it might have been an early estimate based off of some preliminary stuff, but I'll keep my eye out. Robert plays another very long clip from the Chris Stringer interview, it's several minutes long, again showing us that he did in fact watch most of the interview. And then in discussing the amount of Denisovan DNA that can be found in some modern populations, he flashes a bunch of sources on the screen, and all of these sources, I kid you not, are pop science. Not a single actual journal article or study or anything like that. It's all pop science all the time, which, is pretty concerning. If you're trying to be a science communicator, you should go directly to the source and actually read some of that to your audience so they understand what's going on. That's kind of your job. Of course, calling Robert a science communicator is, I was going to say generous, but who am I kidding? Robert Sepehr is not a science communicator. He is not in the orbit of science communication. He is on the other side of the galaxy. But as I've said in previous videos, this should be alarming for anybody who watches Robert Sepehr's content, because that suggests to me, and has suggested to many others, that he does not actually read the sources themselves. He simply reads the coverage in the Pop Science article, which is, as many of us know, frequently not the whole story, or at worst, boldly incorrect. Next, because Robert does not know his way around genetics terminology, he cribs another several minutes from a lecture by David Reich, a geneticist. Reich goes over the history of, like, finding Denisovan's DNA and Neanderthal DNA and all of the admixture and potential introgression into Homo sapiens populations. And really the part that I think Robert is trying to underscore is at the end, so that's what we'll tackle next.
And to help drive this point home with DNA, here's a short excerpt from a talk given by Professor David Reich, a geneticist known for his research into the population genetics of ancient humans.
What's clear from looking at genetic data, not just in Europe, but other places that we and others are beginning to get data from, is that people are the results of layers and layers and layers of mixture. That nobody's pure, and that in fact, those ancestors were not pure either. That in fact, people are just the results of mixtures and mixtures and mixtures. And the right way to look at this may not be that of a tree, but as a trellis, a kind of just layering and layering of mixture.
I don't even think Robert is using this portion because of what Reich is saying. I think he's using it because of what it says on the screen, which is, we are not all African. The problem is, it's not meant to be said like that. That heading is not, we are not all African, as in not everyone has their ancestry from Africa. It's meant to say we are not all African, because everybody has some degree of admixture from some local population as Homo sapiens moved to different areas and interbred and eventually replaced those that were there, like Neanderthals or Denisovans, and so on and so forth. And if you don't believe me, Reich basically says this immediately before the section we just watched.
It was a great surprise. I came from Luca Cavalli's Sforza school, where we thought we all came out of Africa. There was no interbreeding, and I was very much part of that school. My PhD supervisor was part of the group that established that, and when I came into the consortium, my very strong assumption was that that hadn't occurred. And my colleagues and I worked extremely hard, harder than we otherwise would have, to make the result go away, because we were very skeptical of the idea that interbreeding had occurred.
The big surprise wasn't that humans didn't actually originate in Africa. The big surprise was that after leaving Africa, there was a ton of interbreeding with local hominin populations. I know Robert saw this because I pulled that from his video. After the lecture clips, Robert waxes poetic about how he has finally been vindicated and has a series of images like playing in the background of him like with his degrees and looking forlornly in various museums. It's very cringe, honestly.
So I'd like to make 2 points here before we continue. The first is that I'm very glad to hear him admit he was wrong, as my entire academic career was spent fighting and arguing with professors like him about whether or not humanity was hybridized. In other words, interbred with different hominid species. And before the human genome was sequenced, every professor that I ever spoken to at the time unanimously insisted that it didn't happen, that one type of hominin left Africa and mutated or evolved into the various races without interbreeding.
And you're going to see this in a minute, but this clip show just keeps on going as Robert's voiceover transitions from being kind of smug and telling this story that is very, and everyone clapped. Like, I personally don't believe that that happened. I think Robert probably held to a multi-regionalist hypothesis. I don't think he did the whole introgression and admixture route, but that's just me. And the reason I think that is because, again, he doesn't know his way around any genetics terminology, so I suspect that that's not what happened. Maybe it did. I don't know. I also appreciate him showing us his degree because, myself included, many people have been doubtful that he actually received one. So Robert, as I've said in previous videos, I'm sorry, I see that you do have a degree. I don't know anything about that university, but I think Robert probably didn't pay very much attention in his biological anthropology classes because, again, he botches pretty much everything with regard to that and also everything else. I'm going to repeat myself here and say that absolutely no one in the field, whether we're talking about biological anthropology, biology generally, population genetics, not a soul is saying that the races are even a biological reality, let alone that they emerged due to introgression and admixture between ancient Homo sapiens and other hominin populations in each location, that is responsible for the races. That is just absurd. Hominin interbreeding, that happened. That being responsible for race, which is also not a real thing, that did not. I'm going to repeat this again so that I don't get misconstrued. Population variation is absolutely real. There are population level morphologic differences between different groups of humans, skin color, hair color, eye color, all of these sorts of things, even specific genes that might give local advantage to populations within their environment. But these population-specific variations do not map with our conception historically of race. They simply don't. Moreover, genetically speaking, again, humans are ridiculously genetically similar to one another. We're talking 99.9%, you guys. Genetics does not lie. Humans do not have definable races within them that can be identified morphologically nor genetically. This is how we know that biological race simply isn't a real thing. But I'm going to link one of my favorite videos on it by my friend, population geneticist Zach Hancock, who goes over this in depth with the math and everything. This is important to underscore because Robert thinks that races are real things, and more importantly, he places them as the centerpiece of his sort of worldview and hypothesis. This is what he says next.
Just mutating, based on the amount of sunshine and other factors in the environment. Since then, especially during the last decade or so, it's been conclusively proven by DNA sequencing that the various human races came about by different admixture of different hominin species. The dominant contribution that we all share is Cro-Magnon. It was a seafaring race that traveled all around the globe. I guess you could call it similar to colonialism, and it interbred wherever it went.
That sounds like the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
So to be abundantly clear, Robert Sepehr is saying that the modern races, as he conceives of them, come from Cro-Magnon, a group of explicitly European, very white individuals going to different locations around the world and interbreeding with the hominins there. The oldest Cro-Magnon from Sepehr's perspective being roughly 28,000 years old. This entire perspective is instantly blown the F out of the water by the fact that we have significantly older anatomically modern humans, as I mentioned earlier, from places that are explicitly not Europe, in fact the oldest being from Africa by a long shot, then Asia, then Eastern Europe, and then finally Central Europe, as Robert is saying here with Cro-Magnon. Genetics also beats this idea to death, as we will talk about a little bit later more in depth. But also you might be wondering, okay, well, let's play pretend for a minute and pretend that Robert has a single point to be made here that isn't completely made up and fictional. Where did this original Cro-Magnon population come from, if not from an earlier group of hominins? They didn't emerge out of nothing in Europe, did they? Well, Robert's idea, at least in the past, is that these people might have originated from Atlantis.
This guy could quite literally put on the cape and become the real world Batman, and I would still think he sucks.
The concept of Atlantis becomes less fanciful and more probable when one looks at Pleistocene or Ice Age maps of the Atlantic Ocean, when Atlantis was said to have existed and sea levels were much lower, or genetic maps of the Pleistocene distribution of DNA on both sides of the Atlantic, such as haplogroup X. But we never hear about these perspectives because the people that control the media and academia in the 21st century are the same people that were promoting the Piltdown Man hoax during the 20th century.
No, Robert, you absolute goon. East Africa is the location for the origin of Homo sapiens as a species, and most hominins that aren't Homo sapiens as well, like pretty much with the exclusion of Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, and Homo luzonensis. Again, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I want to hear your perspective again first.
Which brings us to sub-Saharan African populations in West Africa, which are comprised of admixture from what scientists are calling a ghost species, because it has not yet been identified in the fossil record, but has been shown through DNA sequencing to be much older than Neanderthal or Denisovans. giving it the label of super archaic, since it is so far removed from modern humans.
Now, because I'm not an uninformed grifter peddling race realism, instead of just showing pictures of pop science articles covering the study, I'm going to take you to the study itself. Fortunately, it's open access, so here it is, recovering signals of ghost archaic introgression in African populations. Now, Robert does get some stuff right, as he almost always does. He's taking something that is a little bit true and then completely skewing it in the direction that he wants to take it. So we see from the abstract here that we're looking specifically at introgression from a hominin lineage into ancient Homo sapiens, and specifically we're looking at into a West African group, so 4 West African populations. This is important to note because Robert's entire implication is that modern West Africans are somehow more primitive than modern Europeans because of this contribution from a super archaic hominin introgression event as compared to the Neanderthal or Denisovans introgression events, which he's painting them as less archaic than what is contributing to the West African populations. Robert explicitly describes this ghost population as being much older than Neanderthals and Denisovans, and thus much more primitive. So I'm kind of wondering, right, like how much older are we talking here? Something important I want to note here before we move on to the next section is that the divergence date for the common ancestor of humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, so specifically like the Homo sapiens lineage and the Denisovan Neanderthal lineage, since the two of them are sister species to the exclusion of Homo sapiens, that is actually also a range. And the tail end of that range, like the sort of older date, is 800,000 years ago, which would, of course, encompass and be older than the divergence date presented in this paper for the archaic ghost lineage and Homo sapiens and Neanderthals common ancestor. More importantly, perhaps, is the actual admixture date is a whole lot younger than Homo sapiens as a species, which is extraordinarily problematic for Robert Sepehr, because by the time this admixture had occurred, Homo sapiens was already an established population and species in Europe, in Australia, in Asia, and of course in East and Southern Africa as well. They actually give an average for the percent of DNA that is putatively archaic in modern populations, and that's between 6.6 and 7%. So right in between the percentages that we tend to find for Neanderthals in modern populations and Denisovans in modern populations, point being not exceptional in that way, almost exactly what we would expect. But they also wanted to test to see if you can find this specific ghost lineage in other African populations. And so they went ahead and tested that. They wanted to see if it was in those populations other archaic hominins such as Neanderthals and Denisovans as well. So they computed the divergence of these segments to a genome sequence from each of 6 populations: Southern African Khoisan, the Julhoan, 2 Central African pygmy populations, the Baika and Mbuti, and 2 archaic hominin populations, Neanderthal and Denisovan. They expected segments introgressed from any of these populations to be less diverged relative to non-archaic segments. On the contrary, the putatively archaic segments are more diverged, consistent with their source not being any of these populations. So the point of this, you guys, is that other African populations do not have this ghost lineage in them, which completely annihilates Robert Sepehr's idea, like on its own, that race is a biological reality determined by introgression and admixture with specific archaic hominin populations such as Neanderthals, Denisovans, and this ghost population. So not only is this ghost lineage not substantially older than the group that would become Neanderthals and Denisovans, not only did the admixture occur around the same time period as some of the later admixture dates for humans and Neanderthals, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, but also, the presence of this admixture in specific West African populations destroys Robert Sepehr's entire hypothesis of race being a result of different hybridization events in the past. But it actually gets worse, because wait till you hear what Robert proposes this ghost lineage was.
West Africans have been shown to contain from 2 to 20% genetics from this super archaic hominin species, which likely is either Homo erectus or Homo habilis, and is not found in the DNA of Caucasians, Asians, or any other non-African demographic.
Nothing this guy can say or do from this point forward that will convince me that he's not an absolute insufferable douchebag.
Homo habilis is like 3.8 million years old if we take the mandible from Ledigararu as being Homo habilis, and Homo erectus is 2 million years old. Now, it persisted into the pretty recent past, but can we just appreciate how he completely just makes that up? That is absolute fiction. And obviously he does it on purpose because Homo erectus and Homo habilis are considerably more basal both in brain case size and other aspects of their craniodental and postcranial morphology than Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and presumably this ghost lineage as well. But again, he didn't read the paper because given the divergent state of this ghost lineage, it literally could not be Homo erectus or Homo habilis, and he would know this if he had bothered to check the actual study out. Things are still worse than that though, because the picture that he shows on screen there to support this notion that this ghost lineage could be Homo habilis or Homo erectus, he's also goofing. The sentence he is pointing at says, back in Africa where Homo sapiens species is said to have emerged, a lack of genetic evidence has left researchers scratching their heads about how exactly we came to beat out not only Neanderthals, but other archaic species like Homo erectus or Homo habilis. It's not talking about interbreeding. This is literally source ? I made it up.
I expect nothing, and I'm still let down.
He clips another lecture, this time of the author of the paper we just went over, and then proceeds to incorrectly recount the results of that paper.
Additional research covering high-coverage whole genome sequences of 15 sub-Saharan African hunter-gatherer males show signs that the ancestors of the hunter-gatherers interbred with one or more archaic human populations, probably around 40,000 years ago, suggesting that the archaic African population and modern humans diverged around 1.2 to 1.3 million years ago.
I am actually begging Robert Sepehr to do 5 seconds of reading before he makes these videos. Because remember, we just went over the results section. The mean for the divergence date was like 625,000 years ago, the minimum being around 350 and the maximum being around like 1.1. So he just took something greater than the maximum and just proposed that. Sepehr provides a third example, this time looking at salivary enzymes, and I just want you to hear the sentence composition of what he says next.
In addition, protein in the saliva of certain African populations, such as the Yoruba tribe, shows evidence that a species of archaic humans contributed DNA into their gene pool, pointing to an extinct group of archaic humans, which appear to have contributed DNA into the gene pool of modern populations in West Africa.
What the hell is that?
In other words, sub-Saharan Africans could not possibly have populated or turned into Europeans. They did not leave Africa and magically mutate 35,000 years ago, as they carry archaic DNA not found in the genome of Cro-Magnons.
What a pathetic, hateful man. You can just hear the desperation at the end of that, where he's just trying so hard to get you to see it his way.
Not found in the genome of Cro-Magnon.
You know where it's also not found, Robert? In the genomes of East and South African populations. But even then, it actually doesn't matter, and again reveals Robert's inability to understand even basic genetics or biological anthropology concepts, because again, Homo sapiens began in East Africa around 300,000 years ago based off of the molecular clock and the fossil record. They leave Africa approximately 70,000 years ago and arrive in Australia, Asia, Europe, etc. And then of those that stayed in Africa, some West African populations encountered other hominins still alive and well in West Africa at that time and exchanged genes with them. This has absolutely no bearing on out of Africa because that happened tens of thousands of years earlier. Before this admixture 40,000 years ago approximately, and well before Cro-Magnon 1, which again isn't even the oldest anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Europe. He compiles all of this nonsense into a nice summary that I'm going to play for you here.
In fact, the evidence suggests things happened the other way around, where Cro-Magnon, fully modern, carrying some Neanderthal admixture, entered into Africa, mated with archaic species, which, as I said earlier, are 1.2 to 1.3 million years diverged from modern humans, crossbred with archaic hominids, such as Homo erectus, which is now considered extinct, but who live on in the hybridized genetics of modern sub-Saharan Africans who have a greater cranial capacity today than Homo erectus had thanks to this hybridization.
So what evidence suggests that, Robert? Like, again, how do you get Cro-Magnon in Europe in the first place if it doesn't descend from earlier hominin populations? And, the answer is it did descend from earlier hominin populations that came from Africa like 30, 40,000 years earlier. And every piece of genetic work on the subject that has been done supports this notion, from nested hierarchies and general phylogeny to heterozygosity and linkage disequilibrium patterns. Robert ignores all of this and instead posits an alternative hypothesis that relies on misunderstanding and misconstruing the very study he is trying to use as a support. He's a clown. Astonishingly, things get stupider when Robert Sepehr, who just got done proposing that Western African populations interbred with Homo erectus and thus derive some of their DNA today from Homo erectus, which again is completely baseless, he plays a clip about why Homo erectus might have gone extinct. Again, the species that he proposes makes up around 20% of modern-day Western African populations.
A news release by the Australian National University notes, citing new archaeological research, that Homo erectus, an extinct species of primitive humans, went extinct in part because they were lazy. The statement goes on to say, an archaeological excavation of ancient human populations in the Arabian Peninsula during the early Stone Age found that Homo erectus used least effort strategies for tool-making and collecting resources. Researchers say this laziness, paired with an inability to adapt to a changing climate, likely played a role in the species going extinct.
So again, I want to ask the Robert Sepehr fans out there, if this isn't the portrait of a racist, what is?
Although hardly publicized by the Western media, there's more published scientific research refuting the out-of-Africa replacement model, showing that sub-Saharan Africans did not leave Africa within the past 60,000 years to populate the world, giving rise to other races. And in fact, it was quite the opposite.
That first paper that he shows is actually published in Advances in Anthropology, which is known for being a predatory journal, and it also doesn't cite any of the papers that I typically cite, thank you Dan of Creation Myths, to support Out of Africa, which suggests to me that it does not deal with them because it is not capable of dealing with them. Again, we're going to go over those papers shortly. This is the second one. It's not been published yet. It's still in preprint, despite the fact that it was initially submitted in 2020, 4 years ago. It has not yet been peer-reviewed and published in any journal, and yet, even with that in mind, this paper does not deny Out of Africa. What it suggests is that Out of Africa is more complex than previously appreciated. It essentially argues that there were Out of Africa events prior to 70,000 years ago, perhaps, and that then there was introgression and admixture back from these populations because humans are human and we continue to exchange alleles through gene flow after we've separated if we are able to. If that came to fruition, I also wouldn't be very surprised. Like, if pockets of humans made it out of Africa, adapted to their local conditions, and then continued to exchange genes with populations in Africa, we know that there were attempts at leaving Africa before 70,000 years ago, as evidenced by the Apodema 1 specimen. Robert confuses the results of that study yet again by proposing that modern Europeans, the Cro-Magnon individuals, came back to Africa and interbred with like Homo erectus-like individuals, and that's how we get modern sub-Saharan African populations.
Where fully modern humans entered into Africa, interbreeding with super archaic hominin species inside of Africa, giving rise to the modern sub-Saharan populations.
Forgetting that, first of all, we were looking at a West African population. Second of all, the admixture occurred like 40-ish thousand years ago, significantly before the Cro-Magnon individuals that Robert cites even existed. And three, the genetic work does not support that this is a mixture of Europeans or Cro-Magnon and some archaic ghost lineage. Instead, we're looking at a group that more or less dispersed from East African populations to West Africa and stayed put, intermingling a bit with other hominin populations that lived there. Robert waxes poetic about how Out of Africa was initially based on just like a poor interpretation of the fossil record, and then he says this:
the Afrocentric propaganda regarding mitochondrial Eve came about in the 1980s, and was pushed by anthropologists in the 1990s.
I don't understand how he can say that. It's called mitochondrial Eve, which means it was rooted in genetic work. He implies that Chris Stringer has backtracked on his position of out of Africa again, playing another long clip. We know that all of this is bogus for reasons we've discussed already, and that Chris Stringer completely disagrees with Sepehr's characterization of him and the current state of out of Africa within the field.
In this article, director of the Genographic Project, an international study mapping the migratory history of the human species, genealogist Spencer Wells says that the Cro-Magnon people, beginning 30,000 years ago, dominated the human expansion into Europe and heralded the demise of the Neanderthal species. Of course, he assumes Cro-Magnon must have originated in Africa.
Then where did they originate, Robert? Oh wait, that's right.
The descendants of the survivors of Atlantis.
Now you might be out there wondering, okay, well, but where did the Atlanteans come from?
That's a great question. I've been wondering that myself.
Which could not be the case, as Cro-Magnon's genome, such as this specimen from 28,000 years ago, did not contain the super archaic DNA found in sub-Saharan Africans, and was virtually identical to modern European populations.
I don't know what is so difficult to grasp about this. Humans left Africa 70,000 years ago, and we nest phylogenetically in an East African group. What does this have to do with admixture and introgression 40,000 years ago in West Africa? Well, it has nothing to do with that, and it doesn't help Robert because those Europeans, including the 28,000-year-old modern European genome of Cro-Magnon, nests in the East African group, meaning they descended from them.
Since Cro-Magnon was essentially a modern European, anatomically and genetically, when exactly did all of that alleged evolution from Africans take place?
Before that.
It did not, and Cro-Magnon did not originate in Africa. Watch my other videos to find out my views on Cro-Magnon or modern humans' actual origins.
I already have, and they're wrong. So I think now's as good a time as ever to touch on the genetic support for out of Africa, why this is such a robust idea that still maintains its status as the best hypothesis for human migration patterns to this day. And by human migration patterns, I mean anatomically modern Homo sapiens, where we began as a species and where we moved from that point. Now, I kind of want to make a point here, because I have used the same clip to explain out of Africa to Robert Sepehr multiple times. I know he's seen it, but he refuses to go over these 4 specific lines of evidence. So I'm going to use that same clip yet again here, and I want you to keep in mind that Robert Sepehr simply doesn't have the genetic background or know-how to actually address any of these points. That's why he won't go over them. Okay, time for paper number 1 to show why Robert Sepehr doesn't know what he's talking about. Again, special thanks to Dan of Creation Myths, because he's the one that gathered all these together for a different video. So, this paper is by Yu et al. 2002, and it's titled Larger Genetic Differences Within Africans Than Between Africans and Eurasians. So what this is effectively looking at is diversity, and we know because of the basics of population genetics that as organisms leave the population that they were born and raised in and split off with other little members of their group to found new populations elsewhere, their genetic diversity is going to be lower than the place that they originated. This is called the founder effect, and it's a type of genetic drift. So if humans originated in Africa, what we should expect is that Africans, or folks who live in Africa and were born there and descend from individuals who are from there, should have greater genetic diversity than non-Africans. And what they did is they sequenced some genes, some non-coding DNA segments, 500 base pair longs, in 10 Africans, 10 Europeans, and 10 Asians. And this was just a really basic analysis that they performed, and if we scroll down to their results section, you get this nice figure titled Figure 1. On the x-axis, we have nucleotide diversity, and on the y-axis, we have the proportion of subsamples, so the wider the curve is, the more diverse the group. And as we can see, African individuals are a part of this wider group here, meaning that they have more genetic diversity than these skinnier little pyramid shapes here, or little triangle shapes here, that are made up by Europeans and Asians. In fact, this was one of the first papers to note the following. This finding, that is the results of their paper, implies that Africans differ on average more among themselves than from Eurasians. Thus, with the exception of many minor unique variants, the nucleotide diversity in Eurasians is essentially a subset of that in Africans, as observed by the observation that both Y-linked and autosomal haplotypes found outside of Africa were often a subset of the collection of haplotypes found in Africa. African individuals are more genetically diverse than non-African individuals, adding support for the out-of-Africa hypothesis for Homo sapiens, the species, around 50 to 70,000 years ago. Let's talk about phylogeny next. Now, you might be thinking, sure, but that last paper was from 2002. Maybe Robert is right, and people have been moving away from out of Africa since then. Wrong-o. This paper is from 2012, and the rest of the papers we'll be looking at are also quite recent. This one looks at nesting with haplotypes from mitochondrial DNA. And what I hope should be immediately obvious, so we've got a lot of different people groups and non-human hominid groups here plotted, and they nest within each other. So what that means is the more things coalesce, right, as things coalesce back here towards the split between humans and chimps, the more ancient sort of the split has occurred. So what we see is the oldest split that happens after humans and chimps is the out of Africa event at 80,000 years ago. What that means is that everyone is in Africa at this time, at the coalescence of all humans. The out of Africa event happens, there's a split, and you get Europeans and Asians, Eurasians, and way down here with the little green, Americans, individuals making it to North and South America. And in a heat map down here, you can see it even more starkly, with the L0 most ancient haplogroup being right here in sub-Saharan Africa. Subsequently, we've got L2 and L3, slightly less ancient, but ancient nonetheless, more ancient than all of these other different groups, and slowly everything spreads out. So everything nests using mitochondrial mitochondrial DNA, everything nests within Africa, yet again. So what we've seen so far is we've got the phylogeny nesting us deep within Africa and human diversity nesting deep within Africa. What else can we compare? How about heterozygosity? Right? So you should remember heterozygosity from like middle school, high school biology. Heterozygosity just refers to the fact that if you're heterozygous for something, then you've got the two alleles or two variants of a given gene. So if you'll remember from Punnett square days, making little Punnett squares, let's say you've got big A, little a, and big A means tall and little a means short. If you have big A, little a, then you have both the tall and short alleles. Now, let's say you have big A, then you've got both tall alleles and you're homozygous dominant. If you have little a, then you've got both the short alleles, the little a alleles, and that means you're homozygous recessive for that trait. Now, due to things like genetic drift, which is a classic mechanism of evolution, if you've got this big ancestral population and little subpopulations split off from it or butt off from it to go do their own thing, they have a higher possibility for the homozygous individuals to reach fixation in those groups, right? So if you're little a, it's going to be pretty hard to move to fixation in a big population. But if you manage to be present in a small population, your odds are a little bit better. So what this means is that the more heterozygous a population, the older or more ancient or more diverse it is. So what that basically means is if a population is super homozygous, it probably split off from a different heterozygous population and is thus not the ancestor of all other populations. So if out of Africa is correct, then we should find high prevalence of heterozygosity in Africa. And that's what this paper sought to do. So this is Herrera's 2009, and they were looking at heterozygosity in particular. Figure 1 is this nice guy right here, and what they've done is mapped heterozygosity nice and neat for us. Move up a little bit here so you can see. Okay, so in pink we have the Americas, turquoise, is Central and South Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa is going to be in red. So what we should expect to see is that the redder the individual, the more heterozygous the population. And as you scroll down here to D, what you can see is that red individuals are indeed the most heterozygous. The conclusion that they state is our analysis both confirm and extend previous studies. In particular, we highlight the impact of various dispersals and the role of substructure in Africa on human genetic diversity. We also identified several novel candidate regions for recent positive selection, which is pretty cool. Among the novel candidate genes were 2 genes involved in the thyroid hormone that show signals of selection in African pygmies that may be related to their short stature. So a third paper, heterozygosity, again supports out of Africa or a human origin in Africa. What should we do next? I think we got one more paper to discuss. Lastly is linkage disequilibrium. So linkage disequilibrium should be higher as you move away from Africa because linkage disequilibrium is indicative in part of small populations. Small populations tend to split off from larger ones, so we should see linkage disequilibrium increase as you move away from Africa. So this study did something really cool. They took the capital of Ethiopia, which is Addis Ababa, and they basically plotted relative levels of linkage disequilibrium or equilibrium as you move further and further away from Addis Ababa. And as you can see again here, this is the SNP haplotype heterozygosity versus distance from Addis Ababa or AA, and you get this linear regression slope. And what you can see is that Africa is again in red, then Europe in green, Middle East in sort of maroon, all the way down to the Americas in purple. And what you see is as you move away from Addis Ababa in kilometers, so 25,000 kilometers away versus 5,000 or less, African individuals show more linkage equilibrium than individuals who are further away, suggesting that Africa is again the spot where everyone's split off from. So,
Like, I'm embarrassing myself if I do that. I was also thinking about getting a sticker on my G. Damn, this is not good.
So again, to be clear, we have our support from out of Africa genetically and morphologically. Morphologically, the oldest anatomically modern Homo sapiens are not found in Europe, they are found within Africa, and simultaneously, this is where 4 separate lines of genetic evidence plants the origins of our species. Robert Sepehr has no counterpoint to any of this, which is why he ignores it and instead presents mangled, horrifically mutilated versions of real studies that do not say what he thinks they say in order to lend himself some artificial credibility. From here on out, Robert doesn't say anything new. He plays clips from old videos that are still wrong, and I know they're still wrong because I addressed them sentence by sentence in previous videos. Boy, it sure would be nice if Robert addressed, like, decent genetic out of Africa arguments sentence by sentence in one of his videos. Too bad he is a simpering coward. We will do a highlight reel really quickly, though, because I just can't stand people being wrong on Maine when it comes to biological anthropology. After giving a shaky account of the evolution of primates, culminating in the origins of humans, specifically genus Homo, Robert Sepehr, confuses Australopithecus sediba with early members of genus Homo, saying this.
With some desperate studies recently claiming that early humans were still swinging from the trees 2 million years ago, which I find laughable.
The reason I say he's confusing them is because Robert Sepehr will vehemently say that members of Australopithecus are not human ancestors because they were so clearly tree-dwelling organisms that weren't capable of efficient bipedality. But the argument that is used to say that Australopithecus sediba, the specimen in the study that he just showed and is incorrectly thinking is an early member of genus Homo, the argument that is used to say that Australopithecus sediba is still capable of swinging through the trees has to do with its postcranial morphology, specifically the morphology of the hands and fingers, the phalanges being relatively curved, aspects of the wrists, so aspects of the carpals, the long arms, and the proposed orientation of the scapula. So the joke here is that Robert Sepehr is saying it's ridiculous to propose that this early human ancestor was still swinging through the trees. I simply don't buy it. But then in the same breath, he will use the same characteristics to say that Australopithecus was definitely not a biped and absolutely must have still been swinging through the trees. The truth is that late members of Australopithecus and early members of genus Homo were both capable of efficient bipedality when on the ground and still maintained arboreal adaptations because they were living in environments that allowed them to benefit from both of these locomotor styles. This is evident, of course, in the arboreal adaptations that I just mentioned that are still maintained in some early members of genus Homo, and that is combined with efficient bipedalism adaptations such as an inline hallux, 3 arches in the foot, a valgus knee, a bowl-shaped pelvis, specific adaptations and curves to the spine such as evident lumbar lordosis, and an anterior foramen magnum. This is, of course, among other minutiae, such as the strengthening of cortical bone in certain locations and the presence of certain muscle attachment sites, etc., etc. But the critical point here is that in Robert's view, an organism must be a clear arboreally adapted organism that did not come down from the ground, an ape, if you will, used in a colloquial sense, or it must be a terrestrial, relatively large-brained biped that is not an ape. And this is because Robert Sepehr doesn't understand the law of monophyly. He doesn't appreciate that humans are still apes. And of course, he cannot comprehend that an organism that is transitional, quote unquote, in nature might have adaptations to both locomotor styles. Robert Sepehr is like a creationist though, and he doesn't consider an organism's morphology in like functional complexes. He just thinks like, oh, it must be a human or it must be an ape. Again, very creationist of him. Obviously, he brings up Nebraska Man and Piltdown Man again, two famous quote-unquote hoaxes, although only Piltdown is a hoax. The Nebraska Man was just a mistake and not one made by biological anthropologists, mind you. But he does use the right clip, so Robert in the past has called Piltdown Man a baboon's jaw glued to a human cranium. Instead, the Piltdown Man is actually an orangutan's jaw with chimpanzee teeth that was attached to a human cranium. But he uses the right clip, so we appreciate that. You love to see personal evolution, if you will. He talks about how the missing link between arboreal apes and bipedal humans has never been found. Again, I've never once seen Robert Sepehr actually address the morphology of things like Ardipithecus or the Australopiths, so I don't know why he feels like he can comfortably say that. He brings up the most recent paper on Sahelanthropus chilensis, the one by, I believe it was Machiavelli and colleagues, that proposed that it is a non-biped, that Sahelanthropus chilensis looks more like a chimpanzee in the cross-section of the femur, and like I disagree with that for reasons that I've also covered on this channel, but in the end it doesn't matter because Sahelanthropus chilensis is still a very basal hominin indeed, if it is in fact a hominin. Robert Sepehr's problem, again, is with Ardipithecus and Australopithecus. But it's not very surprising that he doesn't talk very much about Ardipithecus and Australopithecus because whenever he does, he makes a mistake in every sentence. So let's hear him talk about them briefly.
And yet, the mainstream media and academia tries very hard to force obsolete paradigms to work, despite persistent and obvious gaps in the fossil record, which seem to be pushed to support a political agenda, like out of Africa theory, which involves claims that an ape-like foot with a big toe that sticks out to the angle like a thumb, obviously used for grabbing branches, was actually a bipedal hominin ancestor displayed in many museums.
How is he still making this same mistake? Please, Robert, just Google the pictures that you're actually using. He shows a picture of the feet of Ardipithecus ramidus, a hominin from 4.4 million years ago, and then shows 3 model reconstructions of Australopithecus afarensis, a much later hominin that definitively did have feet that had 3 arches and an inline big toe, much like a human foot. Like, he's supposed to have a degree in anthropology. How is this still happening? And shortly after this, he shows the same screw up from the previous videos where when he's trying to weaponize Owen Lovejoy's work, he shows a picture of Ardipithecus's feet and then just says that you're looking at Australopithecus again. I can't believe it.
Lovejoy has published more than 100 articles related to his research and is most well known for his work on reconstructing Lucy, an alleged human ancestor with an opposable big toe on its feet, meaning they resembled thumbs for grasping branches and climbing trees.
You know, in the midst of all the hateful Robert Sepehr fans, every now and again I do get a Robert Sepehr fan who shows up in my comment section and they're like, yeah, I can see that Robert Sepehr is like really wrong on all of this paleoanthropology stuff. I still like his other stuff, but woof on this one. And like, thank you to those individuals because, you know, being able to admit when you or someone you like is wrong is a really, really important characteristic to have. But like, I'd like to see Robert own it personally. Or at least just stop using the wrong clips. The rest of this video is just more unfunny nonsense that I've already covered where he goofs up a million things with regard to biological anthropology, and I have previously covered all of it, right? So links in the description to other Robert Sepehr videos that I've done where I talk about how many errors he makes in each of these videos that he is just clip chimping himself for. And he ends with the famous Robert Sepehr outro.
My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. My published work is available on Amazon.
My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. My published work is available on Amazon. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. My published work is available on Amazon. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. My published work is available on Amazon.
I thought I would make this video just because anytime Robert decides to man up and make a video on Out of Africa again, I feel like it's my duty to come smack him down. I'm aware that a lot of his fans are going to show up and just be rude and jerky in the comments. that's fine. You guys have my permission to dunk on them for as long as you want to. They don't matter to me. I use them to bolster my channel, to make funny videos about their rude comments, and to outline the type of person that Robert Sepehr's mindset creates. That said, the timing was really nice because I started work on this video and simultaneously he started getting rolled on Twitter by other science communicators. And I just thought that was pretty funny. So I can't wait to share that with them. The science communicators that I'm talking about who I enjoy their work very much are like Zeke Darwin, Seth Shaggy, Chris Stringer is a paleoanthropologist. Obviously, I love his work. He's not really a science communicator, although he is. I would say he actually is. He does good science communication. He just doesn't have like a YouTube channel where he like regularly makes goober videos like the rest of us do. History with Kaylee also had the pleasure of engaging with Robert and seeing his garbage tweets. Pretty much all of us are blocked by Robert because he's afraid of confrontation, hence the title of this video. Like, Robert will regularly try to big boy up and pretend like he's willing to debate, but he is absolutely petrified by the idea of having a conversation with someone who frankly knows more than him, right? Like, I don't think Robert Sepehr has read a biological anthropology paper since he graduated from Northridge. I don't think he's cracked open a book on the subject, to be honest. And Robert Sepehr is not like in his 20s or 30s, I don't think. So it's been quite some time since he's taken a look at the state of the field. Robert Sepehr is, put simply, he's a grifter. He's a swindler, right? He convinces his audience that what he's saying has any modicum of truth to it by peddling out studies and saying they say things that they don't say. As someone who's getting their degree in biological anthropology, their doctorate in biological anthropology, I can at least point out every time he is wrong off the top of my head when he's talking about that given subject. But I've actually had many people email me who are like historians and in other adjacent fields who are able to say, yeah, he's also wrong in all of the other stuff that he talks about. So Robert Sepehr is pretending, he's cosplaying, he is role-playing as an anthropologist. And the reason I say this is because no one who actually has or deserves that title would get so many things wrong in so many different pieces of media that he has voluntarily put up on the internet. Moreover, get them wrong to weaponize them for the purposes of being like a giant racist and anti-Semite, which I think I've shown in this video. He is both of those things. And I think Robert Sepehr fans have their work cut out for them. When they show up inevitably and don't tackle any of these arguments and just blindly defend him because they like him or whatever, like that does nothing to me. I see that and I get a hearty little chuckle for the 0.3 seconds that my brain has recognized that Robert Sepehr exists again, for the moment that I remember that he is an actual entity in the world. And then I go back to living my life because these people do not matter. I should say they don't matter with regard to the scientific community. Robert Sepehr is not doing any real work. He is not discovering anything. He's not doing any studies. He's not doing any field work or anything of that nature. He's not even doing real science communication because he bungles every study he brings up. They aren't harmless, though. The things that Robert Sepehr and his fans say and do actually cause real issues in the real world because they give folks who are anti-Semitic or racist like a grounds to say the things that they say, not for real, but they think that they have grounds to say these things because some guy on the internet who says he's an anthropologist is lending this artificial credibility to them, to their horrible ideas. So in that way, they do matter, and this is why it's important to shoot down pseudoscience wherever and whenever we find it. But Robert Sepehr is like serially incorrect on everything that he talks about with regard to biological anthropology, from the genetics to the paleoanthropology, primatology, things of that nature. And for those Robert Sepehr fans, again, this goes deeper than just having a difference of opinion, like the Ken Ham, same evidence, different interpretation. He actively uses sources that are just not saying the things that he says they say, or he'll put up a picture and then describe the wrong specimen. Like, he's just wrong a lot, and in a way that is easily demonstrable. So Robert Sepehr and his fans, if they really want to debunk out of Africa, they've got a lot of work to do with regard to genetics and paleoanthropology. Anyways, my gentle and of course very modern apes, I hope you enjoyed this kind of fun video. I guess you could call it fun, busting Robert Sepehr's chops again. No doubt there will be more to come from him. I hope this will knock him off his pedestal again for a while and he'll keep his mouth shut when it comes to topics that he knows nothing about, but it is Robert Sepehr, so who knows. If you like what I do, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to my YouTube channel. That's the free way to support me. It always helps. And if you want to help support me in like a financial way, you can join my Patreon. Patrons get early access to videos sometimes. And in the meantime, my gentle and of course very modern apes, I hope to see you real soon next time.